Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today our guest is Fabian Hoffmann. He is a doctoral research fellow at the University of Oslo. Welcome and thank you for this interview.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Fabian, you are a person who has his particular interest in missiles, in nuclear things, in other things. You're a researcher who does a lot of research in Oslo, focusing also on Russia. You run a fabulous Twitter account where you explain all the technical details concerning the missiles which Ukraine has already got and has not got yet. What role do missiles play in this war, in particular from the Ukrainian side?
I would even start like a bit broader. So I think what this war really indicates and demonstrates is that missile systems have become key technologies of modern war. So if you are a state, that considers itself likely to find itself in a warfighting contingency whatsoever, I'm pretty sure one of the key weapon systems that you want to have access to are missile systems, given their enormous utility for a number of tasks. And this is what we've seen on the Russian side. So prior to the war, Russia built up a massive arsenal of cruise and ballistic missiles. Now they've complemented that arsenal with large numbers of drones. And you see the same efforts on the Ukrainian side. So prior to the war, Ukraine was investing in some missile-related programs. Once the war started, these programs turned into crash programs. Ukraine is now able to manufacture some missile system on its own, but of course also has received some missile systems from Western partners. And I think for Ukraine, it's incredibly important to be able to threaten Russian targets in operational and strategic depth. So targets behind the front line, behind what we would call the tactical area of engagement. And this is basically the key task that I would say missile systems play right now, and it's enormously important for Western partners to upkeep that capability on the Ukrainian side.
So if we come back like a bit to the start of this full-scale invasion, we remember that on Ukrainian side there were very small numbers of surface-to-surface missiles, like mostly that were like the last pieces of the Soviet equipment. But on the Russian side, like they were on the Ukrainian side, the Stochka missiles, which were actually like pretty old. And there were a few on the Russian side. They had their new developed Iskander missiles a lot. They had the newly developed Kalibr missiles, the cruise missiles, which were for the sea launch platforms. And we remember the first launch of Kalibr missiles. They tested launch from the Caspian Sea, hitting Syria. It was like about 10 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But the Russians had also a massive arsenal of Soviet cruise missiles, all these Ha-55, Ha-101. And some of these missiles have been transferred from Ukraine to Russia as a part of denuclearization and demilitarization of Ukraine. What roles play these missiles? They are not being constructed for hitting ground targets, didn't they? They were the sea targets.
Yeah, actually, so some of these missile systems were originally intended to engage maritime targets, but that is for a smaller number of missiles. So especially the KH-22 that we're talking about. So that is a missile system that was originally intended during the Cold War to take out American naval strike groups and especially aircraft carrier strike groups. And nowadays, or during the war, given some of the missile shortages that Russia ran into, they had to repurpose some of their designated anti-ship missiles for land attack roles. And unfortunately, these missile systems, they're obviously, given that they do not have some sort of terminal guidance system that is intended to make them suitable for land attack use, they will be extremely inaccurate. And this is why, weapon systems like the KH-22, they're essentially only a terror weapon. The other weapon systems that you mentioned, like the KH-55, 101, the 555, these were indeed legacy weapon systems from the Soviet Union that were built in large numbers during the Cold War, but that are still useful today. And these weapon systems also, they include some sort of terminal guidance system. So while I would say, they are not comparable, let's say, to a Storm Shadow, or an American Chasm or a German Taurus in terms of their accuracy, they are certainly capable missile systems, and unfortunately they have been put to great effect also in Ukraine.
Before we go further to ATACMS missiles and their role in this war and how can Ukraine expand its capacities, could you elaborate a bit on terminal guidance system and what kind of them can be used? What does it mean, and what makes the Russian missiles different from the Western-produced ones?
Yeah. So of course, so in terms of missile guidance, there are two basic guidance systems that are incorporated in most missile systems, especially cruise missiles that have a designated land attack role. So that is first the mid-course guidance. Mid-course guidance is simply there to keep the missile on track. Well, you call this basically the nominal trajectory. So this is the trajectory that is given by the operator. The operator tells the missile, okay, this is, I want you to fly along these coordinates, this route to your targets, and the mid-course guidance system makes sure that this nominal trajectory is indeed pursued. That usually happens through some sort of an autopilot that works with inertial navigation. Inertial navigation basically is a tool that measures the angle, the velocity, the speed of the missile. And in calculating that over and over, it can basically calculate its approximate position in space. The key issue with inertial guidance is that this is somewhat inaccurate. This is why you need other types of mid-course guidance systems, like a TERCOM or a GPS, for example, that helps keep the missile on track. So these other guidance systems, they basically update the autopilot in regular intervals, whether the calculated position of the missile is indeed its true position in space. So this is what you get with the mid-course guidance, and this can be fairly accurate. So if you imagine, for example, the target area as a circle, I would say that simply by relying on GPS guidance, probably you can make sure that the missile will fall into a circle with a 5-meter radius around the target. If you want to get to pinpoint accuracy, so if I don't just want to, like often this circle, totally enough, right? Like often we don't need pinpoint accuracy. But if we need it, or if you want to achieve it, we need to complement the guidance system with what is called terminal guidance. And this terminal guidance system essentially makes sure that in the terminal stage of the flight, the missile receives very accurate updates on the target location up until the very moment it impacts the target. And traditionally, this has been done by a thing called DSMAC, or Digital Scene Matching Correlator, it was created during the 1980s. And often nowadays when we talk about image recognition, it's something we associate with AI, and it's really modern. But they kind of made up something like that, and both the Soviet Union and the United States, they came up with an image recognition tool in the 1980s, where you basically, the operator put in a picture of the target into the missile, and then later on during the flight, the missile would take its own picture of what it believes would be a target, and then it would match those two pictures. And this basically works by comparing the edges of the structure that is being engaged, and that was really effective. So they did that already during the 1980s, and that worked quite well. And again, both the Soviet Union and the Americans. Nowadays, what many missile systems rely on is a so-called imaging infrared sensor. it kind of the idea is the same. It's still based on image recognition. You use infrared guidance simply because that works at day and at night. I'm not dependent on the outside, whether there is light or not. I just am looking at the infrared signature of the target itself. But this is needed for land attack missiles. They need some sort of image recognition to make out whether the perceived target is actually the target they are intended to engage. And these systems have become incredibly accurate over the last couple of years. So nowadays I can tell a missile, not just to engage building A, but engage building A, and please fly into the third window on the left second floor. That would be something that should be possible. Now I'm not saying Russian missiles or also Storm Shadow missiles that have been transferred to Ukraine that have been they're a bit older. They're not as modern, so they will not be that super or extremely accurate, but you still get really, really high levels of accuracy that are more than often more than enough to destroy any target.
Well, that was exactly what I wanted to ask. Like the Russian missiles, they are notorious for the lack of precision. So, did they fail to produce this recognition system properly, or don't they use it, or don't they care, or what is the reason why they hit targets randomly? And as you said, they are actually a terror weapon.
Yeah, so I mean, it really depends on the weapon system, right? Like if you talk, for example, about the Kalibr, as you said earlier, this is the most modern Russian cruise missile. Technically speaking, this missile system should be able to achieve very, very high degrees of accuracy. If it does not, I would say, if it hits an apartment building, I would say, that there are two options. Either there was some sort of systemic error, as we call it, so the missile failed in some way, the guidance system just didn't work, or it was simply targeted at that apartment block, which has also been a common Russian strategy. With other missile systems, so for example, the KH-101, which is a bit older, KH-55 especially, here I would say, given that these things are several decades old, even if they include some terminal guidance system, there is a higher likelihood that these guidance systems simply do not provide these extremely high levels of accuracy. And then it is reasonable to assume, I would say, that the circle that I explained earlier within which the missile will fall, this target radius, is simply higher for those missiles than for more modern ones. And then, again, you have other missile systems like the KH-22 that were never intended for a land attack role. They have a radar seeker for terminal guidance, which is, very effective if you want to engage a carrier strike group out in the ocean. So basically like a huge metal structure in a very, uncluttered environment. There's nothing around it. Sure, that radar system can make out the target, no problem. But it's completely useless for a land attack role because, the radar system cannot differentiate different types of buildings or different types of structure, especially if, land-based targets, they find themselves in what we call a cluttered environment. There is trees around, there may be mountains, there are houses of several of different heights and different kinds of structures. So there's a very cluttered environment. And for this kind of environment, these maritime missiles, they're simply not effective at all. And this is why you then get for KH-22, you get these huge target spreads or area spreads, and these missiles can fall anywhere, I would say, between probably a 500 and 1,000 meter radius. So the operators themselves don't know where they will come down. They just shoot at a certain area, often then a highly populated area for like an area target, like a city, and then it will just come down somewhere.
Well, that is terrifying. That is indeed reflects the Russian tactic of terrorists, of hitting civilians, making life uneasy. We're talking with Fabian Hoffmann, who is a doctoral research fellow at the University of Oslo. We're talking about the missiles in this war between Russia and Ukraine. Don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel. write your comments under this video, and we are going further. And my next question is, there are several types of Western missiles which have been transferred to Ukraine as a game changer, and they indeed changed the outcome of several operations. The first were the GPS operated missiles for HIMARS in summer last year. Then Storm Shadow and SCALP came, and now Ukraine has ATACMS, and ATACMS were the missiles which Ukrainians wish to have a lot. What is the impact of these missiles? What did they demonstrate, and why Russians cannot fight them? Why are they so helpless against the last missile attacks?
Yeah, no, those are excellent questions. So yeah, you're right. So it all started basically with HIMARS being transferred. I think it was announced last June, and I think the first ones arrived in July. And then the corresponding ammunition, the GMLRS, the M30A1 and the M30A1AW. AW stands for alternative warhead. Technically speaking, I would say these are not missiles. They are rocket artillery. But it's a bit a question of terminology that researchers like me can argue about. Because I think there is a blurring line between what is a rocket, what is a missile, and in the end it doesn't matter that much. But these rocket systems, rocket artillery systems, they had a massive impact by basically forcing Russia to reorganize its logistics, pushing back those ammunition depots. All those pictures from last summer where it felt like every second or third day you get like a picture of a massive burning pile of Russian ammunition somewhere. And that had a huge impact. And then there was a big breakthrough this May when the United Kingdom decided to supply Storm Shadow cruise missiles to Ukraine. I wouldn't say they've been a game changer. I don't like this terminology in any way. Like, nothing really in itself is a wonder weapon or a game changer. But what these weapon systems really did is that they heavily exacerbated Russia's tasks in Ukraine and really facilitated Ukraine's task in regaining occupied territory. And Storm Shadow was really effective, and then pushing back those Russian logistics nodes, transport, infrastructure capabilities, command centers further back. And Ukraine was also now, for the very first time, able to threaten targets in all of occupied Ukraine. So before that, unless the Russians were in HIMARS range, they basically had sanctuary in Ukrainian occupied territory because the Ukrainians simply didn't have anything to attack them with. And then once you got the Storm Shadows, which we don't know the exact range that those missile systems have, especially the ones that were delivered to Ukraine. I would assume they're simple baseline Storm Shadows, so they have a range of 540 kilometers. But then you may have some targeting restrictions that basically restrict their range. But in the end, basically these missile systems mean that anywhere inside Ukrainian occupied territory is not safe anymore for the Russians. So you deny them sanctuary. And we've also seen that now increasingly with Crimea. Even on Crimea, the Russians are not safe anymore. And that, of course, has a huge impact. And then the French kindly delivered some of their SCALP EG cruise missiles, which are exactly the same as the Storm Shadow. The main differences are that they have a different software package. Some of that just relates to the language. The French want a French-speaking missile, the British want an English-speaking missile, and also the scalps were manufactured in France, whereas the Storm Shadows were manufactured in the UK. But they're in itself 100% the same missile. Now we got to the stage where we finally have ATACMS in Ukraine. Several months later than they should have arrived, and then would have been necessary, in my opinion. But alas, we got there.
But what was the the situation when the Russians were hit by storm shadows and SCALP, and we could have seen that even the holy places of the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol have been hit. The Russians obviously could not protect their military base itself, which is pretty humiliating for the Russian army and the Russian navy. How was it possible? What kind of evading mechanisms did these missiles use?
Yeah, no, that is a really good question, and you know, something I've been wondering myself. Why has Russia been so incredibly inept in intercepting Western-made cruise missiles? Basically, I would say there are two explanations, right? Either Western cruise missiles indeed like have some sort of evasive capabilities that render them inherently superior to Russian-made cruise missiles, or Russian operators are just incredibly incompetent when it comes to operating their air defense capabilities. And probably, you know, the truth is somewhere in between, so it's probably a mix of the two. Interestingly, right, like we've seen pictures of S-300s on the Ukrainian side, where, you know, like when the Ukrainians, they put on like the targets that they were able to shoot down, they put that like on their air defense capabilities, and you see like S-300s that have like dozens of Russian cruise missiles on them, indicating, you know, that Ukrainians were able to shoot down with these Soviet legacy systems, able to shoot down cruise missile targets. Which indicates, you know, that, yeah, these S-300s, they are in theory capable of intercepting this kind of threat. The question is then, why did this not translate into more success on the Russian side? And in fact, you know, this is really important to point out, and something that I would have never guessed. We still have not received a single piece of, you know, 100% evidence that the Russians were able to shoot down a Storm Shadow. We've seen two pictures of downed Storm Shadows, although in both cases, I would say it is more likely that the missile came down by itself rather than that it was shot down. Simply, you know, if you look at the patterns, you know, there's like no real fragmentation impacts. It just appears that, you know, something brought down the missile that was not an anti-air weapon. Anyways, so then probably, you know, it's Russian incompetence part of it, right? That explains this. The other one is that, you know, missile systems like Storm Shadow, if you look at their radar signature, it is lower than for a KH-101, or especially like even older ones, right? Like some Russian cruise missiles, they have their engine basically attached under the missile, and that creates a huge radar signature. Whereas, you know, Storm Shadow, but also Kalibr, so also more modern Russian missiles, they integrate this engine like directly in the fuselage. So this creates like a lower radar cross-section. Other parts are that, you know, probably the body of the missile itself, the fuselage, is just more reflective, less reflective of radars, of radar. So, you know, again, it's probably like part of it. Part of it is that, yeah, these missile systems are inherently more survivable than the Russian counterparts. And then the other part is just Russian incompetence.
Yes, it could be quite the case. Just remember how the how the missile cruiser Moskva has been destroyed by the Ukrainian by two Ukrainian Neptune missiles. It was obviously because of the incompetence of the commanding officer of Moscow, and of course skills and luck and technology of the Ukrainian army. But what is like the very obvious question when all the nations supply Ukraine with this pretty modern equipment, like not the last years, but the last couple of decades, which is very effective. Why doesn't Germany supply Ukraine with Taurus missiles? And are Taurus missiles really different from what Ukraine has already got?
So yeah, let's start with the second question. They are so Taurus, I always say Taurus is basically 90% the same missile as Storm Shadow. This being said, it was developed a couple years after Storm Shadow and entered into service a couple years later, meaning they were able to implement, some improvements compared to Storm Shadow. So technically speaking, it is a better missile system, yes. But it's the differences are not that big. The main components. So if you look at the guidance system, the warhead system, the engine, like there are differences, but broadly speaking, they are very similar, creating the same type of capability profile. So Taurus would be able to engage the same targets as effectively, if not a bit more effectively, than Storm Shadow and SCALP. The main reason why Ukraine needs this missile so badly, it's a question of quantity, because Storm Shadow, SCALP, we don't know how many have been delivered. I assume at this point that the UK delivered several hundreds, and there were a smaller number of SCALP missiles from France, and probably also Italy, although Italy just didn't announce it. But looking at the rate of usage of Ukraine and also how it has dropped over the last couple of weeks, probably because they were start to run out. It's pretty clear that these initial stocks of cruise missiles, they're empty, or they're getting empty. And they will probably not reach zero, because the Ukrainians, they probably will not use the last reserves unless it's really necessary. But we have seen that the rate at which Ukraine has employed Storm Shadow strikes has dropped, and that probably reflects a shortage in arsenal. And that means, we need to pop up that arsenal, and Taurus would be the obvious candidate for that.
Yeah, that is obvious. Of course, if Ukraine has just more missiles, they can more actively use them, hitting high-value targets like ammunition depots, HQs, like headquarters, some groups of equipment, logistic nodes, etc. That what Ukrainians often say that the Taurus missile allows a better strike on concrete targets, like on for example on the targets like the carriage bridge, which Storm Shadow obviously is not ideally produced to hit. Is it something behind this this idea, or is it just like an argument to force the Germans to send Taurus finally?
No, that's absolutely correct. So in the sense, as I said, the warhead system itself works very, very similar in Storm Shadow and in Taurus. The main difference here is that Taurus employs a different fuse. And that fuse allows it to better engage structures that consist of different layers. That also includes bridges. So basically what Storm Shadow has is a time fuse. It's basically a fuse that, once, let's see, this is the bridge deck, and here's the pillar. So once the missile comes in, it registers the initial shock of penetrating the bridge deck, and then a timer goes off, right? Then the timer, for example, can be put, I think, between 0 milliseconds and 240 milliseconds. Now the challenge for the operator is, because, right, ideally you want that the missile penetrates the bridge deck and then flies into the pillar and then explodes in the pillar. Because then you have, fractured that bridge deck, heavily damaged this, and ideally you have completely destroyed the pillar. But basically the operator has this challenge that the operator has to estimate how long it will take the missile from this initial shock traveling into the pillar and then explode. That is, a time estimate. The operator must say, okay, given the structural properties of that bridge, I estimate that it takes 120 milliseconds, maybe a bit less. But you see how this is bound to be inaccurate, at least in some instances. And actually, we have seen that with Storm Shadow when it engaged some bridges. It appeared that that Storm Shadow, it exploded, or its penetrator exploded before it hit the pillar. And that indicates that the operators, they probably underestimated the thickness of this first layer and how long it would take for the missile to travel through that first layer, or the penetrator. It's not the missile anymore. And then, you still had a great hole in the bridge deck, but the pillar was rather unarmed. Still there may be some structural damage that we do not necessarily see on pictures, but the missile at the bridge is still rather intact. What Taurus does is it does not rely on a time fuse. Rather, it has a fuse, and that is a very complex, very modern technology that's also used in American cruise missiles like JASSM. Rather than counting down a timer, this fuse detects and counts the different layers that the penetrator is penetrating. So, again, the missile comes in, it hits the bridge deck, the fuse registers, okay, this is the first layer. Then it registers after it has penetrated the first layer that it is now in a void space, right? This void space between pillar and bridge deck. And then it registers, okay, now I hit the pillar. So basically what I can tell this fuse is, I want you to penetrate one layer, the bridge deck, then penetrate one void space under the bridge deck, and then explode inside the second layer, the pillar. So I don't have to rely on an inaccurate time estimate anymore. I can, it doesn't matter anymore how thick those layers are, how long it takes the penetrator to travel through these spaces. It just explodes exactly when it is supposed to. And this is the big qualitative advantage that Taurus offers. And because of that, yes, Taurus is better at destroying bridges than Storm Shadow. This being said, I think this is a great qualitative argument. My main argument for Taurus is still just send those goddamn missiles because Ukraine needs Mars. That's the key argument. You need to make sure Ukraine does not run out of these crucial missile systems. And yes, these qualitative advantages, they're nice, and they offer some benefits, but in the end, it's all about the number of missile systems available, and that's the most important one.
One of the arguments which the German Federal Chancellor Olaf Scholz expressed against delivery was that it is impossible, as he said, to program the missile by the Ukrainians, and that in some stages of the programming of setting the course for the target, the Ukrainians would need German support, either in the form of German operator, or in the form of German programmer, or German geodata. And that, what Scholz said, would probably make Germany into like a war party, which, from my perspective, is not that convincing argument, but that is what has been used.
Yeah, no, excellent question. So obviously, everything I can say is based on open source information. So I don't know exactly how the system architecture of Taurus looks like. So I can also only make estimates. But I would say, based on my estimates, and I'm fairly confident in them, actually very confident. I think that this argument, that Taurus would require constant German assistance, that's a stupid Scholz excuse. I don't think this holds true. Why is that the case? So if you look at Taurus as a weapon system, right, like it has been partially developed for export purposes, and it has been exported to other countries. So for example, Spain and especially South Korea is operating quite a substantial number of Taurus cruise missiles. So now for me, there's the big question. If it's indeed only possible to operate these missile systems with German geodata and German operators, why the hell would any country in the world decide to import that weapon system? That makes zero sense, right? Like if I'm a South Korean operator and my task is to deter the North Korean nuclear arsenal, I'm not going to rely on a weapon system that I cannot use on my own. So of course you can use these missile systems without constant German supervision and assistance. There is no question about that. The key question is the training provided, right? Like every missile system, like Storm Shadow, has a mission planning software. This is where you put in those geodata bits. And plan the nominal trajectory as we outlined in the beginning, and where you determine the target. And you know, my understanding is, you know, the same way as it is for Spanish or South Korean operators, if the Ukrainians are provided with the training on the mission planning software, there should be absolutely no reason why it would not be possible for Ukrainians to operate these missile systems themselves. At least I don't see, you know, how you could make any logical argument. So that's the one thing. And then the other thing is, you know, this argument centered around German geodata. That Germany would need to provide geodata with the Taurus missiles in order to make them usable. And that would be impossible for either for technical or for legal reasons. And again, I mean, I have only open source insights into, you know, what is going on, so I can't say for sure. But again, I don't see this as a realistic argument based on my assessment of this weapon system. So this geodata, what this basically does is it provides coordinates, it provides altitude numbers for coordinates in space. Now that this is the whole idea behind it is like that you have to make this TERCOM guidance system works, that as we outlined in the beginning, that updates that autopilot in regular intervals during the flight. And it does so by comparing stored data of, you know, altitude values for certain coordinates with values that are measured during the flight. So, you know, there's like let's say there's a hill, here's the missile, it flies over a hill. Then it has like an altimeter, so a radar that measures the altitude distance to the ground. So it flies over it, and then it recognizes, you know, like, oh, here it's like, let's say 20-meter distance, here it's 15, here it's 10 to the missile. So this is the measured data that's in there. And what it does is basically it compares this measured data with stored geodata. So it has the same kind of data in the missile already, where it says, you know, when you are at point XYZ, your measured altitude value should be 10 meters, 15 meters, 20 meters. And by comparing those two values, it can confirm that the missile is either on track or not on track, requiring a course correction or not. So this is what you need the geodata for. But again, this geodata, in my understanding, you know, this is very neutral. There is no targeting information behind it. And here's the kicker, right? Like the West already provides Ukraine with actual targeting data since day one. The Americans have told the Ukrainians countless times, hey, look, there's an interesting Russian targets at these coordinates, please strike it. My understanding is the BND, the German intelligence service, has done the same. And so compared to this data, which, you know, is very sensitive because it directly translates into Russian targets, this geodata is actually very neutral. There's nothing sensitive behind it, because in the end, it only tells you that for coordinate XYZ, the altitude value is 10 meters, 50 meters, 20 meters. That's it. Nothing crazy about that. And so here you see, I don't see why you would need legal clearance for that. Or, you know, as the German said, the Scholz made this argument that he would need basically a constitutional clearance from the parliament to be able to send this data. And I do not understand, you know, I really try to understand it, but I really do not understand why you would need agreement from the parliament to send this kind of data, while you can simply send actual targeting data to the Ukrainians without any prior agreement. This makes no sense to me. So, you know, in my opinion, there is no barrier to sending this geodata. But okay, let's give him all the benefits of the doubt, right? Let's say there actually is one. Either it's technical, it's legal, Germany simply cannot do it. Then Ukrainians would still be able to collect their own geodata. And I'm 90% certain they have already done this. Because again, Ukraine builds its own cruise missiles. Ukraine needs this geodata itself. Of course, they probably already have collected that for their surroundings. It would only make sense. And they don't need their own satellites for that. They can hire, you know, private satellite providers. And as it turns out, last summer, the Ukrainians actually hired a private satellite company that has this kind of capability. So we don't know if they collected the geodata, But if you take into account all the circumstantial evidence, I would say there's a really, really high likelihood. So now Germany could also just send a missile without the geodata, and probably it would work. So all these arguments, in my opinion, and I try to approach it, less from an emotional side. I really try to approach each argument. Does it make sense? And I don't see it. So for me, it's very, very, very clear that there are no legal counter arguments. There are no technical counter arguments. The lack of delivery can only be explained by lack of political will. So Chancellor Olaf Scholz and probably, a fraction inside the SPD, they perceive the delivery of long-range strike weapons as a red line that they're not willing to cross. And so far, they have not yet been convinced to do otherwise.
That indeed looks like that. Like many observers I talked to express the same opinion. It is more a political decision based on some like ideological arguments, not on the technical or legal ones. Before we go into the last part of our interview with Fabian Hoffmann, who is a doctoral research fellow at the University of Oslo, don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe. And now my last group of questions regarding the future of this war on its missile warfare. For we have heard already many times that Russia is getting run out of missiles, and that Russian arsenals are getting depleted. Indeed, Russia has reduced the intensity of their strikes on Ukraine, but never stopped. And Russia says that they can produce new missiles. Obviously, there are evidences that the lifespan of Russian missile between production and being fired is very short, which can prove the idea that they are running out of missiles, but still they have plenty of them. How long can Russia supply their troops with enough missiles to make Ukrainians' life harder?
Yeah. So unfortunately, right, and I knowing how much carnage and destruction and sadness Russian missiles have caused, right? I hate to say it, but I honestly believe all these assessments that we've seen over the last couple of months, or maybe even stretching back a year now, that Russia at one point will run out of missiles. Not realistic. Actually, what we're seeing right now is that Russia still manages to increase the output of produced missile systems, and without doubt, the quality of missile systems has decreased. So probably they suffer in terms of their accuracy. It is more likely that these missiles will fail either during launch or in flight. So hopefully never reaching Ukrainian targets. But a large number of missile systems, even though they lack in quality compared to earlier ones, that they're still usable. And yeah, what we've seen is that Russia has actually been able to increase output, simply by substituting some of the sanctioned Western components or importing them via third parties. Or also part of it is simply that nowadays their missile manufacturers they're running 3 shifts, so they're producing 24/7, and that also just increases output as long as they have material, which they appear to have. So the question I always get asked, like about sanctions, then people always say, no, look, sanctions have been useless then, and absolutely not. I think when it comes to sanctions, they had a massive impact. The key issue with sanctions is, I would say in the public debate, we often attach wrong utilities to sanctions, right? Ideally, we want sanctions to work in a way that they coerce the receiver of sanctions to change its behavior. So for example, we would really love for our sanctions to coerce Russia into giving up its military objectives. If you look at, if you analyze sanctions, basically throughout their history, like since World War II, this type of change in behavior has very, very rarely been achieved. It can, but usually that's not the case. But here's the thing. Sanctions are really effective in signaling, right? They're like a signaling tool. This is why, one of the first things the EU does when something goes wrong, they impose sanctions. like to basically signal to the international community, like this is something we really do not approve of. And B, they're really good at constraining. And this is what we have also seen with Russian defense industry in general and with the missile manufacturers. Without sanctions, Russian missile production would probably be double or triple. So, you know, instead of producing 50 to 100 cruise missiles per month, they might have been able to produce 200 to 400 a month. So in that sense, right, like sanctions work. But what you're not going to get to is the point where Russia is unable to produce missiles anymore. This will not happen. So Ukraine basically, and Western partners of Ukraine, they have two options. Either you continue to increase Ukraine's air defense, air and missile defense capabilities to further lower the number of non-intercepted missiles that actually reach their targets inside Ukraine, or, and this would be my preferred approach, and also that of the Ukrainians, you allow Ukraine to strike those manufacturing plants inside Russia. And you know, I understand, you know, like the argument. Well, I don't subscribe to it, right? But like the argument is that if we enable Ukraine to strike these kinds of targets, the war will escalate and it will end in a NATO-Russia confrontation. I don't believe necessarily that's the case. But you know, so rationally speaking, I don't think this is a good argument. I also think it's morally speaking, it's terrible because, you know, at one point, Chancellor Olaf Scholz and Biden, they have to ask themselves, you know, in their effort to prevent this monster of escalation, right? Like this is the big monster in the room for them. At one point, you have to ask yourself, when do I become the monster myself? I feel like this is my opinion. I know, you know, people share this. At some point, you also just have to accept, you know, some risk, because in the end, you have to understand that the war that we make, that the Ukrainians have to fight due to the lack of courage of Western partners, is a war that NATO would never fight itself. I can guarantee within the first week of a NATO-Russia confrontation, the entire Russian arms industry is grinded to a halt, because these are the types of targets that have very, very high priority for NATO to take out. Exactly the same, by the way, for a China-US confrontation in the Asia-Pacific. One of the first targets, or maybe not one of the first, but within the first couple of days and with high priority, the targets that the United States would strike inside China are related to arms industry. Because, you know, in order to win a war of attrition, and the war in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, is nothing than a war of attrition at this point, the best way to win this is to make sure that the adversary runs out of equipment. And yeah, one way is to destroy that equipment at the front. A way better way is to make sure that equipment never reaches the front. So you destroy it in the deployment and pre-deployment stage. This is exactly how the Allies defeated Germany in World War II. It was much less battlefield success than it was simply about grinding to a halt the German arms industry. So the best way to make sure that this war does not go on for, you know, longer than it has to would be to enable Ukraine to strike these targets inside Russia. And I think until this happens, either because the Western partners allow it or Ukraine comes up with its own capabilities to strike these targets, I think unfortunately Ukraine will find itself in a disadvantage, and that is very unfortunate.
Wow, that is a strong argument, not only for providing Ukraine with missiles, which can strike within several hundreds of miles, but also to allow Ukraine to strike these production sites, which effectively produce means to kill Ukrainian civilians and to prolong this war. It was Fabian Hoffmann, who is a doctoral research fellow at the Oslo University. Thank you very much for this interview. Don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe. And thank you, Fabian Hoffmann, once again.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was great.